So I mentioned that I want to talk about some specific glazes and their formulation. I also want to talk about some effects or faults in the glazes. And what I've got as examples is some glazes that are in the main YVC studio, so these aren't necessarily the glazes we're using in the online class. And to remember, all of these we're talking about texture, melting temperature, color, and opacity. And so I've included that on a few of these examples. So this piece here was done with Korean Celadon. This is a glossy glaze. Celadons are glazes that you will encounter if you're in other clay studios. The Celadon name means it's semi-transparent, often kind of a greenish. There are different kinds of Celadons, so we can have more brown or more green or more blue Celadons, but usually they'll be semi-transparent with a lot of gloss. This one was designed for cone 10 and it has minimal flow. We can actually see that there's some flow down here at the bottom by the way that glaze has pooled a little bit down there right above where the wax was applied. We can also see that right around the edge of the handle. This is kind of a greenish brown glaze, and it's semi-transparent. So if we put something underneath it like a slip, we're going to be able to see that slip through it. This is a type of glaze that also collects in textures really well. For folks in the online class, the red and the blue do some of that, but I think the cola green is the one that has the most variation in color. This is another very different example, and this is actually two glazes together, which is kind of interesting because they act different than the glazes by themselves. So this is Ninja Junior Crawl, which is a crawl glaze. It's been designed, that's the white stuff. It's been designed to have this thick texture. And when it's by itself, it actually bubbles up and has like little round bumps of color. In fact, I think we can see it in right here on this guy. It's a little hard to see, but we can see it on that pot and this pot right here. It's a textured glaze where stuff has been added to it to make it, I think it's magnesium carbonate has been added that makes it pull away from itself like that. In this case, though, because it's over the temoku, and temoku is another kind of glaze that we've got it in the studio, but you'll find it in other studios. It is a reddish brown kind of glaze that when it gets thick looks black, and when it's thinner it's a little bit more brown. It's a pretty typical glaze that you'll see in a lot of studios. The crawl, though, so the temoku doesn't have a lot of, it's an opaque glaze. It's kind of a matte or satin kind of gloss. It's not super runny unless somebody has put too much on, which happens sometimes. And that glaze acts that way when it's by itself. When it's combined together with the temoku over the top, with the Ninja Junior Crawl over the top, the Ninja Junior Crawl crawls less, because essentially it's sliding on the surface of that glaze that has more flow to it. So the temoku is a meltier glaze, and the Ninja Junior is a less melty glaze. But when they're together, the one moves over the top of the other, essentially. They'll look different if you put them in the other order. So if you put Ninja Junior first and then put put temoku over the top, the effects will be different because the meltier glaze will be moving over the top of the less melty glaze. Now, if you've worked with the Ninja Junior Crawl, you'll probably find that it actually cracks off. We've got other sorts of issues to deal with. Both of these are pretty opaque glazes. One is the brown black and the other one is the white, and you see the white really holds up when it's fired together. Now, lots of times people fire glaze or layer glazes over the top of each other. This is by local artist Mike Heiler, and the pieces here, you can see the layers of glazes, which is why I picked his work to look at. What he's done is he's put down a dark glaze, maybe a temoku or something like that, and then he's kind of wiped it away, so it stained the surface of the pots, and then he put a semi-transparent glaze over the top of everything. And so what we're seeing at the top and probably the inside is just that transparent or that white glaze by itself. What we're seeing here in the middle or on the top of the teapot is the semi-transparent over the top of that stain of a darker glaze. And what we're seeing at the bottom is the porcelain clay with that stain, but there's hardly any flux left. We've kept kind of the color and not much of the gloss or the meltiness. So it's important to remember that anytime you mix glazes together, whether you're doing a stain, putting one glaze on and kind of wiping it away and then putting another over the top, or if you're just painting them or dipping them on top of each other, those glazes react with each other. And when they react with each other, we often call it eutectics. Eutectics really specifically refers to the fact that two things together will melt more than either one on their own. You might think that if we took a not very melty Ninja Junior Crawl and a kind of melty Temoku, that when we put them together, they'd melt a medium amount. But that's not true. They both melt more because of this eutectics. And then we also find some interesting reactions. In fact, the Korean celadon is one that I think is lots of fun. Because see this little sparkly stuff, these little dots and stuff? That doesn't usually show up when this glaze is used by itself. Those little speckles show up when it's layered with something else. And my guess, this is quite old, so I can't quite remember, but my guess is that this stuff right here is a layer or a paint of something else. So those are the examples I have for the Cone 10 stuff, but I've got some from our studio, but I've got some other things to talk about, and these are getting into what are technically faults in the glaze, but people often take these faults. Faults means it's a mistake, essentially. But oftentimes mistakes are used intentionally, and so what was a fault to one person might be a goal for somebody else. So in this example, this is a raku-fired piece, something of mine from undergrad. And what we're seeing here is this crackle glaze. This is a yellow and red glazes that are crackles. What's happening is the glaze has cracked. We know this from talking about raku before. The glaze has cracked, and normally we might not be able to see that very well. But then this has been put in a bucket of combustible, so what we're looking at is smoke that we can see through the cracked glaze. Now, if we're not firing raku, we call that cracking crazing, and we think of it sometimes as a problem, right? A glaze fault. That cracked glaze, what's happened is, for some reason, the clay has shrunk less or more slowly than the glaze has. And so as the glaze shrinks, because it was 1800 degrees or 2300 degrees or however hot it was in the hottest time in the kiln, as it cools down, the clay and the glaze have to cool. If they don't cool at the same rate, then that glaze can crack. And in bad cases, it can crack off. So we call that crazing when it actually fall, or shivering sometimes it's also called, when it actually falls off. It cracks so much that it's gone. When we put it in when we do a raku, that transition from the hot kiln to the cold bucket or the outside is really, really fast. And so those glazes tend to crack quite a bit. Now, they don't crack off, at least we usually don't have them do that. And so we don't call it a glaze fault, we call it the plan, right? These glazes are an example of something where it's cracked, but it hasn't cracked off, and so we've got what is essentially a pretty texture on that surface, right? This semi-transparent glaze. In the regular clay studio, we have a copper glaze, Pfaffy's Copper Red, that crazes. You can't see it when it's the red copper because it's somewhat opaque, but when it's been oxidized, it shows up, and so students often ask about that. Now, this is another interesting example. This is a situation where this glaze has not matured, and I've got matured in quotation marks. As you recall, we have maturation points for glazes. They melt at, cone 10 or cone 6 or cone 06 or whatever. This glaze here is showing us something that happens during the firing process. So normally we don't get to see this. Sometimes in a raku kiln we do. But during the firing process, the air that's in remember how your pot was porous when you glazed it? Well, that air that was in those pores has to go out, and it has to go out through the glaze. And so during the firing, usually when we can't see inside, that air goes through and causes bubbles all over the surface of the glaze. This person here has trapped those bubbles in the midterm, right? They let them come all the way out, or the bubbles came out, and instead of waiting a little bit longer and letting the surface melt down, they just stopped the kiln right there, probably let it cool a bit. I'm guessing they reheated it and cooled it very slowly because these aren't sharp bubbles. When this happens in our studio, because we've underfired the kiln or because somebody put glaze on too thick, is another time it can happen. When that happens, they are usually sharp because they're glass. In this case, the person has really controlled it on the way down. Now, I mentioned crawls before when we were talking about the Ninja Junior crawl. A crawl effect where it pulls away, that can be a defect. It can also be something that somebody puts on intentionally. And you can already tell by looking at the outside of this piece that this would be a nice glaze for the outside, but probably not an effect you'd want inside your cereal bowl in the morning, right? Because all those little cracks between the glazes are going to capture, food particles, and it's going to be hard to clean. But it can be a really interesting texture on a sculptural piece. The last kind of effect I've got here is crystalline glazes. And these are ones we usually don't use in the studio because of how they have to be fired. So basically you put in these crystalline forming things. You can buy them in the glaze, or you can even buy them separately and put them into a glaze. You fire these guys up, and then when the kiln gets to the top temperature, usually that's in the evening when we fire the glaze kiln at school. So usually in the evening, I'm ready to shut that kiln down and go home. And I shut it down, I close it up, and I let it cool slowly overnight. A crystalline glaze, you shut it down, and then you let it cool a bit, but then you heat it up again. And so basically you control the kiln so it cools down very, very slowly. And as it cools slowly, those little crystals that started out as little dots grow and grow and grow. And so you can get this neat effect. Now, if you've been thinking about what happens when we get glaze up to its melting point and then keep it there, what happens is it's going to keep melting. And so one of the things you'll often see in a crystalline glaze, if you pick up the pot, is it will be ground at the bottom, like ground with a Dremel or a grinding wheel, because it has continued to melt down the surface of that piece. And as it melted down the surface of that piece, it caused a puddle, and later that has to be cleaned out. So there are other kinds of effects that we can talk about, but those give you kind of a taste of some of the effects that we've seen, and I'm happy to talk with you more about them. The one thing I want to remind you is that some of these effects can be, not necessarily a problem. If the crazing, if it's not coming off, isn't necessarily a problem. If you've got glaze that's exposed like this, you've either underfired it, which you don't really have control over, or the glaze is actually too thick.